In part 1 of the selection process, we covered the selection procedures option 1 and option 2. If you've missed that video, please go watch it before you continue with part 2. Let's jump in on part 2. We're going to be covering the purpose of the interview and the role of the interviewer before and during the interview. This includes the role of the interviewer before they come into the interview and during the interview. We're then going to cover the role of the interviewee during the interview. And then we are ready to look at an employment contract. And with an employment contract, we're going to look at details of an employment contract as well as the legal requirements of an employment contract.
You come upstairs with me for an interview.
Getting a call that you have an interview is very exciting. But what is the purpose of an interview? The purpose of an interview is that it creates an opportunity where information about the business and the applicant can be exchanged between the two. So we would call you in if we were a business, and then we would have a chat with you to find out more about you as an applicant. And you would also find out more about the business that you would want to work at, what they stand for, their values, etc. Interview helps that process so that information is exchanged. We also gather information about the strengths and the weaknesses of the person who is applying so that we can choose the best candidate for the position. And then number 3, we determine a candidate's suitability for the job. So we check and see if the person will be able to add value to the business or not during an interview. Also, it helps the employer in making an informed decision about the most suitable candidate for the job. Because we're not going to be interviewing one person, we're going to be interviewing different people for the job so that we get the best candidate for the job.
We want the best.
Yep.
Another point is that it matches the information provided by the applicant to the job requirement. Remember that spec that we spoke to in the first video? We check and see if the candidate that's in front of us meets the requirement that we have for the particular job so that he can add value to the business. And then the next point is we evaluate the skills or the personal characteristics or qualities of each and every candidate that we see to see if they are skillful enough to add value to the business. And our last point is, to a certain degree, we verify the accuracy of the information provided by the applicant on their CV. And I say to a certain degree because you can't be 100% accurate, especially in the interview. There's other things that we do after the interview to verify the information that's on the CV. Let's talk about the role of the interviewer before the interview. What are the responsibilities of the person who's going to be conducting the interview before the actual interview happens?
What are my responsibilities?
Point number 1 is that it is important that they develop a core set of questions based on the skills, knowledge, abilities, and competencies required by the business so that we get the correct person. So you cannot be asking random questions to different people and not gathering the actual information that we need and to find out the skills that the applicants have by having a set of questions when you're interviewing.
You must ask the right questions.
Point number 2 is the interviewer needs to check and verify the CVs of the people that they want to come in. Point number 3, the interviewer needs to book and prepare the venue for where the interview is going to be held. And then the next point would be set the date, and of course, if it's possible, have the dates be on the same date so that it's easy for the panel as well as the person that's conducting the interview. And next point, you need to inform all the shortlisted candidates about the date and place of the interview so that they can also prepare. And of course, you also need to notify the panel members who are going to be conducting the interview. And if it at all possible, send them the information about the candidates so that they can prepare for the interview. And our last point, allocate the same amount of time for each candidate for the interview on the program. is the role of an interviewer during the interview? The interviewer needs to allocate the same amount of time to each candidate that's going to attend an interview. The interviewer needs to introduce the members of the panel to the candidate that's attending.
I'd like to start off by introducing one of you.
And the next point would be to make the interviewee feel at ease during the interview. It's also important to explain the purpose of the interview to the panel and the interviewee. The next point would be to record the responses of interviewees for future reference. And then a very important point is to not misinform or tell lies or mislead the interviewee by giving false information or false hope.
You lied to me!
And then on the next point is to provide an opportunity to ask questions by the interviewee so that they are also able to learn about the business and understand the business. So that opportunity needs to be created by the interviewer.
That, detective, is the right question.
At the end of it all, it's important to close the interview by thanking the interviewee and then making sure that we appreciate the time that they made to come to attend the interview.
Thank you for coming.
And then our last point is to make sure that the interviewer poses the same set of questions to all candidates or interviewees and not be favorable to one interviewee instead of another. Very important to know and be able to answer the question that you might get in a scenario to say, outline 3 roles of a person as an interviewee. This time we're going to look at the role of an interviewee during an interview. So the person has gotten a call, they've been shortlisted, now they need to attend an interview. When they walk in an interview room, it's important to greet the interviewer by name. Do a solid handshake with a friendly smile. And the next point is to, while you're busy attending the interview, the person needs to listen carefully to the question before responding. There's nothing embarrassing by answering a question that hasn't been asked because you thought you knew what the person was asking you. So it's very important to listen carefully and then respond appropriately. Next, make eye contact and have a good posture or a good body language during the interview. We all know about crossing your arms, that you're not open to that. So your body language is very important when you are busy with an interview. Next point, show confidence and have a positive attitude. In other words, show assertiveness, understand who you are and represent yourself. An interview is for the person to be able to sell their skills. So be sure about what you know and how you are as a person and be confident and show that in an interview. Next point would be to be inquisitive and show interest in the business, meaning you would have researched the business so that you are able to show inquisitiveness and you are able to ask relevant questions about the business. Next point would be to ask clarification if you're not sure and ask clarity-seeking questions. That would be the questions that will make the interviewer give you more details, meaning it shouldn't be a yes or no. It should be questions that propel the interviewer to give you more information. That's the clarity questions that you need to ask.
Can you clarify for me really?
Next point is to show respect and treat the interview with its due importance. It's not fun and games. We're not playing. It's a very important thing in interview. Next point would be to be honest about your mistakes and explain how you dealt with a mistake that you might have had that could possibly come up in an interview. So don't hide things and lie, because that's not a good thing. The lie would come out eventually.
I need to be honest.
Next point, know your strengths, know your weaknesses, and be prepared to discuss them with the interviewer. And the last point would be thank the interviewer for the opportunity that you were given so that you're part of the interview. Be polite and be thankful, and then leave on a very good note.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
The candidate has been picked, and now it's time to talk about the contract, the employment contract.
What does that mean?
So what is the meaning of an employment contract? The employment contract establishes both rights and responsibility of the employer and the employee. Employment contracts details the rights and responsibility of each party. The other meaning of an employment contract is that it specifies the duties that would be carried out by the employee in exchange of a remuneration by the employer. Let us now talk about the details of an employment contract, meaning what forms part or what should be in an employment contract. The employment contract needs to have the personal details of the employee. It needs to have the details of the employer, for example, the name of the business, the address of the business, etc. It needs to have a job title or a job position. It needs to have the job specification, for example, the formal qualifications or experience or their willingness to travel. It needs to be stated in the employment contract. It also needs to have the date of employment. When did the person commence, or when is the person going to commence working in the business?
Excited about starting work today?
It needs to have the place where the employee will spend most of his time working and the conduct of their working activities. It needs to include working hours, for example, the normal time and overtime. It needs to include remuneration, for example, are they going to be paid weekly, bi-weekly, fortnightly, or monthly? And it also needs to include benefits or fringe benefits or perks or allowances. It also needs to include leave, maternity leave, sick leave, annual leave, adoption leave, etc. It also needs to include employee deduction when it is either compulsory or non-compulsory. It also needs to include the period of contract or the details of termination. We also need to include the probation period, and it must also have the signatures of both the employer and the employee. It also needs to include the list of documents that form part of the contract, as well as the disciplinary policy, for example, rules regarding disciplinary procedure, acceptable behavior or non-acceptable behavior. It needs to include that. And those are the details of the employment contract, what should form part of the employment contract. Let's look at the legal requirement of an employment contract, meaning the legalities of an employment contract. An employment contract is an agreement between the employer and the new employee that's going to be coming to the business, and this contract is legally binding.
This is legal, I tell you. It's legal.
What other legal requirements is that the employer and the employee must agree to any changes of the contract. The next point is the aspect of the employment contract can be renegotiated during employment. You know, when the teachers are negotiating or renegotiating their increases and things like that, that can be done with the person working in the company.
It's time we renegotiate, Nino.
Next point, no party, meaning the employer or the employee, can unilaterally change the aspect of the employment contract. They can't make any changes by themselves. The employer can't decide to decrease your remuneration without your agreement as an employee. Next point, the employer and the new employee must both sign the contract. And on the next point, the employment contract should include a code of conduct and a code of ethics. And another legal requirement is that it may not contain any requirement that conflicts or that does not comply with BCEA. You remember the BCEA that we did? If you forgot it, we have a video that can remind you the BCEA. Next point, the conditions of an employment or duties or responsibilities or the roles of the employee must be stipulated clearly on the employment contract. And our last point is that the remuneration package, including the benefits, must be clearly indicated on the employment contract. And that concludes the selection part 2 part of our video. Thank you so much for joining us on this video. We will see you on our next video.